For decades, we've been told a polished version of American history, heroes glorified, mistakes buried, and entire stories erased. But what if the truth about the United States is far more complex, hidden behind propaganda, politics, and power? Today, we uncover what they never wanted you to know, the missing pages of American history. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who tells the story. From school classrooms to national museums, the story of America has been carefully crafted, a story of liberty, triumph, and destiny. But buried beneath that polished tale lies another history, one filled with hidden motives, silenced voices, and untold truths. In this episode, we'll peel back the layers of time to expose what they tried to erase, the untold history of the United States. Have you ever wondered who actually decides what version of history we're taught? Think about it. From the moment we step into a classroom, we're fed a narrative. Dates, names, battles, and victories. But have you ever questioned who chose those stories? Who decided what to include? And more importantly, what to leave out? History, as we know it, is not a neutral collection of facts. It's a carefully edited script, written, rewritten, and filtered through the lens of power. Every empire in history has shaped its legacy, and the United States is no exception. The idea of America as a land of freedom, justice, and opportunity was built not only on revolutionary ideals, but also on the erasure of uncomfortable truths that didn't fit that image. The manipulation of history in the United States began almost as soon as the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence. Textbooks, government speeches, even Hollywood films all have played a role in crafting a narrative that glorifies certain figures while conveniently ignoring others. George Washington becomes the untouchable hero, while the enslaved people who built his wealth are footnotes. The Founding Fathers are celebrated as pure defenders of liberty, while the contradictions of slavery, indigenous genocide, and economic exploitation fade into the background. This isn't just coincidence, it's a deliberate act of storytelling. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as the nation expanded and industrialized, the U.S. government and influential publishers began shaping historical education to serve a specific purpose: national unity. The goal wasn't necessarily to tell the truth. It was to create citizens who believed in a shared, simplified version of the past. Textbooks published in the early 1900s avoided discussing the brutality of colonization, the forced removal of Native Americans, or the racial terror that followed Reconstruction. They focused instead on invention, courage, and destiny, a story easy to digest and even easier to control. By the time the 1950s arrived, this version of American history had become almost sacred. The Cold War era transformed historical education into a weapon of ideology. The message was clear: America was the land of the free, the ultimate good guy in a global battle between democracy and tyranny. Any discussion of America's internal contradictions, segregation, imperialism, corporate control, was treated as unpatriotic. In schools, teachers were encouraged to emphasize the nation's triumphs and downplay its failures. Even the Pledge of Allegiance, added with the words "under God" during this era, became a daily ritual of reaffirming a single, unquestioned identity. And then came Hollywood. Film studios realized they could make history not only entertaining but powerful, a soft tool of influence. Westerns painted pioneers as heroes taming a savage land, while indigenous peoples were reduced to nameless obstacles. War movies turned complex global conflicts into moral fairy tales. Even the stories of civil rights struggles were often sanitized to make audiences comfortable, removing the raw anger and radicalism that powered real movements. Through entertainment, the myth of America grew stronger until it became nearly indistinguishable from reality. But history has a way of fighting back. As new generations began asking questions about Vietnam, about Watergate, about racial injustice, cracks started to appear in the polished story. Hidden archives were uncovered, voices long silenced began to speak, and historians started piecing together the version of history that had been buried under layers of patriotic myth. They found that what had been presented as facts were often interpretations designed to protect those in power. For example, early school textbooks described the colonization of the Americas as settlement, a word that erases the violence. disease, and displacement inflicted on millions of indigenous people. Similarly, the Civil War was long portrayed as a noble conflict over states' rights, a phrase carefully chosen to obscure its true cause, the preservation of slavery. Even the labor movements that built America's working class were often minimized or vilified, their leaders portrayed as troublemakers rather than reformers. This manipulation doesn't just distort the past, it shapes how we see the present. When citizens grow up believing their country has always stood for freedom, they're less likely to question modern injustices. When systemic oppression is edited out of the story, people fail to recognize its echoes in today's society. And when only a select few are celebrated as heroes, generations of contributions from women, minorities, and marginalized groups are erased from the collective memory. What's most unsettling is how subtle this manipulation is. It's not about blatant lies, it's about emphasis, omission, and repetition. If you tell a partial truth long enough, it becomes accepted as the whole truth. History becomes propaganda not through fabrication, but through control of perspective. And that's the real power of historical manipulation. It doesn't just change what we know, it changes who we believe we are. When you realize that, you begin to see history differently. Every story, every monument, every heroic moment deserves to be questioned. Because behind every official version of events, there's another story waiting to be told, one that was silenced, ignored, or erased in the name of national pride. And only by uncovering those hidden stories can we begin to understand the true, unfiltered history of the United States. When we talk about the founding of the United States, certain names immediately come to mind: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. Their faces are carved into mountains, printed on money, and enshrined in our collective imagination. But here's the question: were they the only founders of America? Were they the only ones who shaped the ideals of liberty, justice, and independence? The truth is they weren't. There were countless others who played vital roles in the creation of this nation. People whose names never made it into the textbooks, whose contributions were erased, forgotten, or intentionally ignored. Let's go back to the 18th century. While white men in powdered wigs debated independence in candlelit halls, there were women, indigenous leaders, enslaved Africans, and working-class revolutionaries who fought for the same ideals, often with more courage and sacrifice than the celebrated elite. Take, for instance, Ona Judge. She was enslaved by George and Martha Washington. When she escaped from the president's household, she defied the most powerful man in America. Her story wasn't just about freedom, it was about reclaiming humanity in a nation that preached liberty while practicing bondage. Yet for over 2 centuries, her name was buried, omitted from the official story of America's founding. Or think about James Armistead Lafayette, an enslaved man who became a double agent during the Revolutionary War, posing as a runaway. He infiltrated British camps, providing intelligence that helped General Lafayette secure a victory at Yorktown, a decisive moment in America's independence. Without his courage, the war might have taken a very different turn. But how many schoolchildren ever learned his name? His contribution was so crucial that even Lafayette himself petitioned for his freedom, yet James Armistead was left out of nearly every historical record for generations. The story of America's birth also includes native nations, who played roles far more complex than the simple enemy label they were often given. Tribes like the Oneida, for example, allied with the Americans during the Revolution, providing food, soldiers, and strategic intelligence. Their loyalty came at a heavy cost: betrayal and land theft after the war ended. The Oneida were promised gratitude. Instead, they received broken treaties. Their story doesn't fit the clean, heroic version of history we've been told, and so it was conveniently erased. And what about the women? The founding era is often painted as a man's world, but behind the scenes, women were fighting their own battles for freedom and equality. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, famously urged her husband to remember the ladies when drafting new laws for the nation. He laughed it off. But women like Mercy Otis Warren, a playwright and political thinker, used her words to challenge tyranny. She published pamphlets and essays that inspired revolutionaries, shaping the political discourse of her time, yet her name barely registers in the story of America's founding. Let's not forget Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American woman to publish a book of poetry. Enslaved and denied basic rights, she used her pen to express revolutionary ideas of freedom and human dignity. Her words reached across the Atlantic, earning admiration from figures like George Washington. But after her death, she was written out of literary and national history because her brilliance contradicted the racist belief that enslaved Africans lacked intellect or creativity. Then there were the common people, the farmers, blacksmiths, sailors, and workers who filled the streets during protests, who risked their lives in battles, who endured hunger and poverty while elites debated independence in safety. The American Revolution wasn't won by generals alone. It was fueled by ordinary people who believed in something greater than themselves. Yet their names, their struggles, their sacrifices rarely appear in the grand narrative. It's important to understand why these stories were erased. The early leaders of the United States were not just building a nation, they were building a myth. A myth of noble founders guided by divine destiny. In that myth, there was no room for enslaved people demanding freedom, no place for indigenous nations claiming sovereignty, no recognition for women or the poor demanding equality. Including those stories would have shattered the illusion of unity and moral purity that the new nation wanted to project. So they were written out systematically, intentionally, and completely. As the centuries passed, this selective storytelling hardened into truth. History books celebrated the polished heroes while the complex, diverse reality of America's origins faded from view. The Founding Fathers became almost godlike figures, their flaws softened, their contradictions ignored. But the forgotten founders, the ones who didn't have statues built in their honor, represented something far more powerful. They embodied the true meaning of revolution, the fight for freedom, justice, and human dignity in all its messy, uncomfortable reality. These forgotten figures remind us that America was never built by a handful of men. It was forged by millions of hands, many of which were bound in chains or silenced by prejudice. Their stories tell us that freedom in America was never simply granted, it was fought for, over and over, by those denied it. And while history tried to erase them, their impact still echoes through every struggle for equality. Every demand for justice, every movement that refuses to accept the polished version of America's past as the whole truth. When we hear about the growth of the United States, we're often told it's a story of courage, exploration, and destiny, a young nation expanding westward, taming the wild frontier, and bringing civilization to a vast new land. But beneath that shining image lies one of the darkest and most deliberately hidden chapters in American history, the so-called manifest destiny. The belief that America was destined by God to stretch from coast to coast became the moral justification for conquest, displacement, and destruction on an unimaginable scale. It wasn't destiny, it was design. In the early 1800s, as the new United States looked westward, its leaders spoke of opportunity and progress. Politicians promised land for settlers, riches for entrepreneurs, and freedom for all who dared to move beyond the Appalachians. But there was one problem: that land was already home to millions of indigenous people. Entire nations with their own governments, cultures, and histories had lived there for thousands of years. To fulfill the dream of expansion, those people had to be erased physically and historically. This is where the story of America's growth turns into one of its greatest moral contradictions. Presidents like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson preached liberty while signing policies that legalized mass removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, one of the most infamous laws in U.S. history, forced indigenous tribes from their ancestral homelands to make way for white settlers. The government called it relocation. History books softened it to migration. But for the Cherokee, Choctaw Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, it was a death march, the trail of tears. Thousands died along the way, not from war, but from starvation, disease, and exposure. At the same time, expansion wasn't just about land, it was about power. The more territory America claimed, the more resources it controlled: gold, timber, cotton, and later oil. Each new frontier became a stage for wealth and dominance. The myth of the pioneer spirit celebrated the rugged individual who conquered the wilderness. but it erased the fact that this conquest was backed by the U.S. military, by government policies, and by the blood of those who resisted. Every fort built in the West, every railroad line that cut through indigenous lands represented not progress, but displacement and erasure, and it didn't stop there. As the nation's hunger for land grew, expansion turned into invasion. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. The conflict was framed as a response to aggression, but in truth it was about territory: Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. By the time the war ended, the U.S. had seized nearly half of Mexico's land. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed under pressure, and the people living in those regions, Mexicans and indigenous communities alike, suddenly found themselves foreigners on their own land. Their rights were stripped, their property confiscated, and their cultures suppressed. Yet, in the national story, this war became a tale of bravery and heroism, another step in America's inevitable march westward. Manifest Destiny was not just a slogan. It was propaganda, a tool to disguise conquest as divine purpose. Newspapers, preachers, and politicians repeated it until it became unquestionable truth. The narrative painted expansion as benevolent, suggesting that America was bringing democracy and enlightenment to savage lands. But what it truly brought was domination, exploitation, and environmental devastation. Entire ecosystems were destroyed to feed the growing appetite for progress. The bison, once numbering in the tens of millions, were nearly wiped out, not just for profit, but to starve indigenous nations into submission. Even when new territories were settled, the people who worked that land were often excluded from its promises. Chinese laborers built the railroads that connected the country from east to west, enduring brutal conditions and deadly work. Irish immigrants toiled in mines and factories, their labor fueling industrial growth while they faced discrimination and poverty. African Americans, both enslaved and free, found themselves caught in a cycle of exploitation, used to build the wealth of a nation that refused to see them as equals. Yet, in the patriotic retelling of expansion, these groups rarely appeared. The glory went to the pioneers and generals, while the builders of the nation were forgotten. The westward expansion also gave rise to myths that still shape American identity today. The cowboy, the frontier hero, the self-made man who conquered the wilderness. But those myths hide the violence and suffering beneath. The cowboy's freedom existed because indigenous freedom was destroyed. The frontier hero's independence was built on land taken by force. Even the idea of the American dream, that anyone could rise through hard work and determination, was born from this narrative of conquest, but it was a dream that excluded entire populations from its promise. The dark side of expansion isn't just a historical event, it's a legacy that continues to shape the United States today. The same land taken during the 19th century became the foundation of American wealth and power. The same stories used to justify expansion still echo in political speeches about American greatness. And the same silence that erased indigenous and non-white contributions from the national story remains a barrier to understanding how the nation truly became what it is. What we call growth came at a cost that's rarely acknowledged. Behind every acre of farmland, every city built in the West, and every road that cuts through mountains once sacred to native nations, there are stories buried under layers of myth, stories of lost resilience and survival that the official history never wanted us to remember. War has always been presented to us as a story of heroes and villains, noble battles fought for freedom, justice, and democracy. But if you look closer at America's history, you begin to see another pattern, one that isn't about patriotism or protection, but profit and power. Behind every flag waved and every speech about liberty, there were corporations, bankers, and politicians who saw war not as tragedy, but as opportunity. The story of America's wars is not just about defending ideals. It's about how industry and hidden agendas turned conflict into business. Let's go back to the 19th century. When the U.S. entered the Mexican-American War in 1846, it was justified as self-defense, but it was really about land and resources. The annexation of Texas and the conquest of the Southwest weren't just victories of arms, they were victories of expansionist economics. The new territories brought massive new opportunities, gold, trade routes, and agricultural riches that would feed the growing industrial machine of the East. Even then, wars were investments, expensive, bloody, but profitable. As the decades passed, the machinery of war and profit became inseparable. During the Civil War, Northern industrialists built fortunes by supplying weapons, uniforms, and railroads. Some of those same business empires would later dominate American politics for generations. War contracts created tycoons, and tycoons influenced policy. Abraham Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, but while soldiers bled on the battlefield, powerful businessmen were already calculating the post-war boom, steel, rail, coal, and the rebuilding of an economy that would now run on industrial might. Fast forward to the 20th century. World War I officially, America entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. But long before the first U.S. soldiers stepped onto European soil, American banks and manufacturers were already heavily invested in the outcome. Companies like DuPont, Bethlehem Steel, and General Motors became critical suppliers to the Allied powers. Banks such as J.P. Morgan financed billions in loans to Britain and France. War meant massive profits. Every bullet, every uniform, every tank had a price tag. And when war became business, peace became bad for business. After the war, when millions returned home and the world faced economic instability, the same corporations that had armed Europe began shifting focus to rebuilding and rearming. It was a cycle: create the means for destruction, then profit from reconstruction. But the Great Depression revealed an even darker side. Corporations that had supplied America during World War I were now doing business with rising powers overseas. Historical records show that some American companies continued trade with Nazi Germany even after Hitler's rise to power, chasing profit over principle. Then came World War II, the so-called Good War, the one we all grow up believing was the ultimate fight between good and evil. And yes, it was a war that stopped tyranny and genocide, but it was also the greatest industrial project in history. American factories didn't just produce weapons, they became the heart of a new economic order. Companies like Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and IBM transformed wartime production into corporate empires. The government poured billions into defense contracts and in doing so, created what President Eisenhower later warned us about: the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower, himself a war hero, saw the danger clearly. He warned that a permanent armament industry, one that thrived on constant production and fear, could distort democracy itself. He understood that when profits depend on war, peace becomes less desirable. But by then, it was too late. The Cold War had begun, and fear became the new fuel of the economy. During the Cold War, the hidden agendas multiplied. Every confrontation, Korea, Vietnam, the arms race, wasn't just about ideology, it was about maintaining control of markets, resources, and influence. The Vietnam War, for example, was sold to the public as a fight against communism. But behind the scenes, it became one of the most profitable wars for defense contractors in U.S. history. Helicopters, bombs, chemicals, every tool of destruction meant billions in contracts for private corporations. Meanwhile, soldiers on the ground and civilians in villages paid the real cost. It wasn't just the defense industry that profited. The rise of oil interests, international trade, and reconstruction projects turned global conflict into a perpetual business model. When the Cold War ended, it didn't stop, it evolved. The war on terror took its place, driven by the same mix of fear, politics, and profit. Massive corporations like Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon became household names, not for innovation, but for the scale of their war contracts. Trillions of dollars flowed into wars that were often justified with vague goals and uncertain outcomes. Each generation was told the same story, that these wars were necessary for freedom, for security, for peace. But the pattern remained. Every war created new industries, new debts, new fortunes. And as those fortunes grew, so did the influence of the people behind them. Politicians who once warned against corporate power now relied on it. Think tanks, lobbyists, and media networks began shaping public opinion, ensuring that the machinery of war never truly stopped turning. The reality is that the US economy became addicted to conflict. Weapons became exports. Bases became businesses. The same rhetoric of defense and security justified military interventions that often had more to do with protecting corporate interests abroad than safeguarding democracy. And with each new conflict, the true reasons were buried deeper beneath layers of patriotism and propaganda. War had become a system, a self-sustaining engine where fear feeds funding. Funding fuels industry, and industry influences policy. It's not just about soldiers and battles anymore. It's about boardrooms and contracts, about who benefits when nations bleed. And once you see that connection, once you trace the money behind the motives, you realize that the history of American war is also the history of American profit, one that continues to shape the nation's choices long after the guns fall silent. Every generation in America has had people brave enough to challenge the system, to speak the truth, to demand justice, to expose corruption. But just as often, those voices have been silenced, erased, or rewritten. The story of the United States is filled with movements that fought for equality, truth, and transparency, yet their leaders were discredited, imprisoned, or even killed. The official version of history celebrates freedom of speech, but behind the scenes it tells a different story, one where speaking too loudly can make you disappear. From the very beginning, dissent was seen as dangerous. After the American Revolution, when workers began demanding fair pay and farmers rebelled against economic injustice, they weren't treated as patriots, they were labeled traitors. Take Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Poor farmers in Massachusetts rose up against crushing debt and unfair taxes. They had fought for independence, believing it would bring justice. But when the new government turned out to favor the wealthy elite, they were met with military force. The rebellion was crushed and the message was clear: freedom had limits, especially when it threatened power. That pattern only grew stronger with time. In the 19th century, the abolitionist movement was treated as radical and dangerous. People like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman risked their lives to expose the horror of slavery, but they were hunted, silenced, and dismissed by politicians who claimed to stand for liberty. Newspapers sympathetic to slavery labeled them agitators. Even after the Civil War, when Reconstruction promised freedom and rights for formerly enslaved people, a campaign of terror, censorship, and propaganda destroyed that progress. The Ku Klux Klan didn't teach violence, they used fear to suppress voices demanding equality. And while textbooks later framed the post-war South as a time of rebuilding, the truth is that it was a systematic effort to bury black political and social power. Fast forward to the early 20th century, when industrialization gave rise to the labor movement. Workers across America, in coal mines, factories, and railroads, began to organize, demanding fair wages and safe conditions. The response from corporations and the government was brutal. Strikes were broken with bullets. Labor leaders like Eugene V. Debs were arrested, jailed, and painted as enemies of the nation. The media, owned by industrial giants, called them anarchists and threats to democracy. The irony was staggering. People fighting for basic human rights were labeled as the danger, while those exploiting them were hailed as patriots. Then came the Red Scare, one of the most chilling examples of how fear can be weaponized to silence dissent. In the aftermath of World War I, anyone who criticized capitalism or supported workers' rights could be branded a communist. The government launched raids, deported immigrants, and blacklisted artists and thinkers. And again in the 1950s, under Senator Joseph McCarthy, the hysteria returned. Teachers, actors, journalists, anyone who spoke against the status quo was accused of being un-American. Lives were destroyed, careers ended, reputations ruined. The so-called land of the free became a place where silence was safer than truth. But even in that darkness, voices continued to rise. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s shook the foundation of American society. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is now celebrated as a hero, but during his lifetime, he was relentlessly targeted. The FBI labeled him a threat, wiretapped his phones, and tried to destroy his credibility. When he spoke against the Vietnam War and the economic injustices behind it, even his allies turned against him. The government feared his influence because he was an T just fighting for racial equality. He was exposing the deeper system of inequality that held America together. And when that truth became too powerful, his life was taken. Dr. King wasn't alone. Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Medgar Evers, Angela Davis, each of them faced the machinery of suppression in different ways. Fred Hampton, the young leader of the Black Panther Party, was only 21 when he was killed in his sleep during a police raid. His real crime wasn't violence. It was unity. He was bringing people together, black, white, Latino, and poor, to fight the same system of exploitation. That kind of power terrified those in control. The suppression of voices didn't stop with race or class. In the 1970s, whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg exposed government deception in the Pentagon Papers, revealing how the Vietnam War was built on lies. Instead of being praised for seeking truth, Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act. Decades later, others like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden would face similar persecution for revealing the hidden operations of power, wars fought in secrecy, citizens spied upon, governments lying to their people. In each case, the narrative was the same. They were called traitors, not truth-tellers. Even movements for women's rights faced the same treatment. Suffragists were beaten, jailed, and force-fed for demanding the vote. Leaders like Ida B. Wells exposed lynching in the South and were targeted for doing so. In the 1970s, activists who pushed for reproductive rights and workplace equality were branded as radicals trying to destroy traditional values. The more progress they made, the louder the opposition grew. And in more recent times, we've seen how the suppression continues, just with more sophisticated tools. Peace activists during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were surveilled. Journalists exposing government misconduct were threatened or silenced. Digital censorship and disinformation campaigns now shape public opinion faster than any newspaper ever could. It's no longer just about silencing voices, it's about drowning them in noise, making the truth harder to find. Throughout American history, every movement that has tried to reveal injustice has faced a wall of resistance built on fear, power, and propaganda. The stories of these suppressed voices remind us that history I send T just what S written, it S what S allowed to be told. The real heroes of America were often the ones who refused to stay quiet, who stood up when silence was the easier path, and who paid the price for daring to tell the truth. For centuries, the story of the United States has been written by the victors, shaped, polished, and presented as a tale of triumph and destiny. But today, a quiet revolution is happening. Historians, journalists, researchers, and ordinary citizens are digging through the layers of myth to uncover the truth that was buried beneath. They're challenging the official version of history, and in doing so, they're changing how America sees itself. This is the new battle, not fought with guns or politics, but with facts, voices, and the courage to question everything we thought we knew. The journey to reclaim the true story begins with acknowledging how much has been hidden. For generations, archives were locked away. Documents were classified and records destroyed in the name of national security or public order. But with the rise of digital technology, that control has started to slip. Thousands of files once kept secret are being scanned, leaked, or declassified, revealing uncomfortable truths about wars, covert operations, and political manipulation. Each uncovered document becomes a crack in the wall that's kept the truth in the dark. What's emerging is a far more complicated America than the one we learned about in school. It's not just a land of freedom, it's a nation built on contradictions. Freedom for some, oppression for others. Innovation and progress paired with exploitation and inequality. For many people, this revelation isn't about tearing America down, but about understanding it honestly for the first time. Because when you know what really happened, you can finally begin to heal what's still broken. Modern historians are now rewriting the chapters that were deliberately left out. Indigenous scholars are piecing together oral histories and artifacts to restore centuries of erased culture. Descendants of enslaved people are uncovering family stories once buried by silence, connecting their ancestors' experiences to the broader national narrative. Even institutions once complicit in distortion, universities, museums, and media outlets, are beginning to confront their own roles in spreading myths. For the first time, history is being written not from the top down, but from the ground up. It's not just academics leading this charge. Ordinary people, journalists, activists, teachers, and digital archivists are playing their part. The internet has become a new kind of battlefield for truth. Social media threads, podcasts, independent documentaries, all of them challenge the polished narratives fed to us for decades. In the past, you had to rely on textbooks approved by committees or networks owned by corporations. Now, anyone with access to information can tell their version of the story. Of course, this freedom comes with chaos. Misinformation spreads easily, but it's also creating space for truths that once had no voice. Take the story of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, a thriving black community known as Black Wall Street, wiped out in one of the worst acts of racial violence in U.S. history for nearly a century. It was omitted from textbooks, newspapers, and even public memory. It wasn't until historians and community members started digging through archives and interviewing survivors that the story finally came to light. That rediscovery didn't just rewrite a local history, it forced the entire country to confront how easily entire tragedies could be erased when they challenged the image of national progress. Reclaiming the true story also means revisiting the icons of history. We're learning that heroes were flawed and villains were often more complex than portrayed. Thomas Jefferson wrote about liberty while enslaving hundreds of people. Abraham Lincoln opposed slavery but struggled with equality. Christopher Columbus was celebrated for discovery while committing acts of brutality. For decades, these contradictions were downplayed because the myth of moral purity was more comfortable than the truth. But the new generation of historians refuses to accept comfort over accuracy. They understand that truth doesn't weaken a nation, it strengthens it. At the same time, technology has opened new ways of seeing the past. AI models can now analyze declassified files, digitize newspapers, and handwritten letters at incredible speed, revealing connections and patterns historians once missed. Satellite imagery helps locate forgotten mass graves of Indigenous children near former boarding schools. DNA research reconnects descendants separated by slavery and forced migration. Every new discovery fills another blank page in the story that was left unwritten. And yet, reclaiming the true story isn't just about exposing the dark side, it is also about celebrating what survived. The cultures that refused to die, the communities that rebuilt after destruction, the resilience of people who kept their histories alive through songs, stories, and memories, even when official records denied their existence. In a way, these hidden histories are the real story of America, the story of survival against forgetting. Still, not everyone welcomes this new truth. There are those who see it as rewriting history for political gain, as if acknowledging injustice is an attack on identity. Laws have even been passed in some states to restrict how history is taught, banning discussions about race, gender, and power. It's the same old fear that the truth might make people question too much. But this resistance only proves how powerful truth can be. Because once people start asking who wrote the story, they begin to realize they can write it themselves. All across the country, new monuments are being built, not to presidents or generals, but to victims and fighters, to women, to indigenous nations, to people once erased from the narrative. Schools are renaming themselves after those who were forgotten. Museums are returning stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. Even Hollywood, once a factory of propaganda, is beginning to tell stories that challenge rather than glorify. The process is slow, controversial, and messy. But it's happening, the rewriting of America's story, not as myth, but as truth. The movement to reclaim the true story of the United States isn't about rewriting history to fit an agenda. It's about restoring what was lost, acknowledging what was hidden, and finally giving voice to those who were silenced. It's about seeing America as it truly is, not perfect, not pure, but human. A nation built on both greatness and grief, progress and pain, ideals and hypocrisy. And in that honesty lies something far more powerful than myth, the chance to finally understand who we are and how we got here. So, what happens when a nation finally confronts the truth it's been hiding? When the curtain is pulled back and the stories that were silenced begin to speak again? What we find isn't just a different version of history, it's the soul of America itself. Every hidden file, every forgotten voice, every buried event tells us that the real story of the United States is not one of perfection, but of perseverance. The untold history of this country is a mirror, one that forces us to see both the brilliance and the brutality, the ideals and the injustices. For too long, we were taught that patriotism meant pride without question. But real patriotism is the courage to face the truth, even when it hurts. Because a nation that cannot confront its past cannot shape its future. When we dare to uncover what was erased, we begin to see how deeply connected everything is, how the struggles of indigenous nations, enslaved people, immigrants, and everyday citizens form the backbone of America's real identity. The myths we were told made us comfortable, but the truths we uncover make us free. And that's what this journey is all about, reclaiming our right to know, to question, and to remember. History isn't something fixed in textbooks or carved in stone. It's alive. It evolves as we uncover more, as we listen to those once ignored, as we reimagine what America truly stands for when it faces itself honestly. They tried to erase the truth, but truth has a way of surviving. It lingers in the margins, it whispers through generations, and when the time is right, it rises again. And now, it's our turn to listen, to learn, and to tell the story as it was meant to be told, the untold history of the United States finally revealed.